Hey, what's up, guys? It's Michael from the Honest Youth Pastor, and today we are going to be looking at the next verses in our study of the book of James, or the letter that James writes, rather. Today we are going to be, as you can see on your screen, we're going to be in verses 9 through 18. It's going to be the second half of what we looked at last time. If you want to look back at the last video, you can go ahead and click the link or whatever is up here, and that'll kind of catch you up. The basic gist of last time is that James was talking to the 12 tribes of the dispersion. They're going through various trials, but he wants them to understand that there's supposed to be some joy in those trials because those trials produce something in them, and it helps them see what they focus on. It helps them see where their hope is in, what they're anchored in. In fact, he talks about in verse 5, if you lack wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask with faith, with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. That's where we ended last time. And the idea here is that he's pushing them and reminding them that all of their hope should be in Jesus. And this hope that is in him is because of the steadfastness being produced in them because of their trials. Now, he moves on here to something, and we'll see in verse 9 specifically, that ties in. You have to understand that when these letters are written, and I think you get that, but just as a reminder, they're to be read all the way through because there's context. But just like if you were to write a letter, everything that you're writing builds upon the last thing you wrote. Like there's a reason you're writing it and how you write it. So James, when we get to verse 9, we have to keep in mind of what he said before that. So he's talked about counting those trials as joy because it tests our faith. It builds steadfastness. It helps us see, what our hope is in. And then he goes into verse 9. So let's read that. Verse 9 is on your screen as well, but it says, let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass. Its flower fails, and its beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. Verse 12, blessed be the man who remains steadfast until under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say that I'm sorry, and we'll stop there real quick. So we'll start again at verse 13. But we have to understand that this ties in, the verses we just read tie into the previous thing. So he's talking about various trials, about those various trials building steadfastness in them, and how they should not be double-minded. They should know where their trust lies. Now, he goes into the thing that, not only in our culture, but also in, obviously, James's society, that really dictates kind of, a lot of your life as far as your financial well-being. Are you poor? Are you rich? Are you middle class? A lot of things rise and fall on that, and many people put their hope and their value in that, right? So even this year, financial instability isn't just like in our day and our age. Like that happened throughout time. So maybe it wasn't money for maybe in James's day as much as it is like in property and in animals and in like your wealth was built up in all of that. But the point is, our security oftentimes it relies upon, do we have enough to help us later? What can we fall back on? What's our plan B? What's our plan C? And James here is speaking to these people, and he's already talked about trials and steadfastness and knowing where your hope lies. And then he goes into money or this security part of it. Verse 9, let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation. The idea here is that if you don't have a lot, boast in the fact that you know Jesus, right? Though you have nothing, boast in the fact that you at least know the one who controls everything, the one that saved your soul. Though you may not have a lot of physicality around you, understand that he's got it. God's got it. We see this Sermon on the Mount, especially where Jesus talks about the fact that God is in control. He's concerned about, if he's concerned about the sparrow, he's concerned about you. And that, James tells him, I know a lot of times when I don't know how broke you've been, but I've been broke before, to where it was like, I don't know what I'm going to eat next. I guess it's going to be like a $1 cheeseburger off the dollar menu today because that's all I got. And he's saying that when we're in those situations, it's hard. He's not downplaying it. He's just saying that you're going to be very tempted, like the previous verses, right, to be double-minded. Well, is God really here? Is he really taking care? He goes, these trials bring forth this steadfastness in you, so you can rely on the Lord. So he says in verse 9, let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation. Now, he goes on to the other side of it, which is pretty dangerous as well, which is the wealthy. He says, and let the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass, he passes away. Here's the idea. Like lots of times, if you have money, a lot of your money or your wealth, right, you put a lot of stock in that, right? So you think, well, I'm good. Something happens, I've got a backup plan. If something comes along, I'm prepared for it. And what he's saying is that, yeah, you might be prepared, but you need to boast in the fact that that's not your hope. He goes on to explain why, because he goes on to explain in the second half of verse 10, because like a flower of the grass, he will pass away. Verse 11, for the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass, its flower fails and its beauty perishes. So will the rich man fade away like in the midst of his pursuits. The idea here is that you might have a whole bunch of wealth and you may have a whole bunch of plan B, C, D, E, F, Gs, but God can eliminate all those plans. It doesn't matter, what your plans are, and you should prepare, but he says don't put all your hope and your stock in that. Boast in the fact that you could be humiliated by God, like you could be brought down by God at any moment to show where your hope is in. So for the lowly brother, he says, boast in the fact that you know the Lord. For the rich brother, boast in the fact that you know the Lord. Like the point is that you shouldn't have your hope in other things other than in your Lord and Savior. And this ties into what we've already looked at in James, where he says, look, you're gonna have various trials, you're gonna have various things that come about you, but hey, take joy in those, because those actually build in you something that could not be built in you otherwise. And for those, he says, of you that like you're poor, you don't know where your next meal coming from. Hey, boast in the fact that you know the Lord. Hey, rich, boast in the fact that God could bring you down at any moment. And both of you need to trust in him, he says, because at any moment, everything could change. Verse 12, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. Now, some commentators are split on if James is now returning to the previous thought where he's talking about the trials and stuff, or if the money situation ties into that, right? So for the one commentators that say the money situation ties into it, what he's saying is for them, for what James is talking about, the various trials that they're going through right now are some financial ones. That's what some of the commentators allude to because of how the flow works here in the book of James. The idea here is that, hey, you're going to face various trials. Some of you are going to be really rich. Some of you are going to be really poor. But regardless, as you go through these trials of financial ups and downs, stay fast in the Lord. Don't let your hope and your hope rise and fall based upon how financially secure you are, because that could change in a moment, and the Lord's in control of it all anyway. So in verse 12, he goes on, if that's kind of the line of thought, he goes into verse 12 saying, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those that love him. Let no one say, and then here, let's move on here. So verse 13. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. James here does something that it's not unique, but he words it in such a way that this is going to be one of the only places in Scripture that we kind of see it worded this way, where he really puts the responsibility square on you as a believer, right? On us as a believer. So again, within the context of everything we're reading, he's talking about various trials, standing fast in those trials, and understanding that our hope through everything relies on Jesus. So then he goes in and says, hey, let no one say that he is being tempted. He says, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. Again, if we're looking at context, which is incredibly important whenever we're looking at letters found in the scriptures, we have to understand, again, like I said at the beginning, this all flows together. So the idea here is that obviously various trials could mean various things. So there's going to be various temptations that we face. But what James is saying is that when we face those various temptations, don't think that, oh, well, God, I'm being tempted by God. He says, actually, each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. Now, mind you, he's already talked about being double-minded. He's already talked about being steadfast. So what he's saying is when this is going to happen to us, right? We're going to be, double-minded. We're going to be tempted to be double-minded because of all of the trials and various things we're going through. But he says, don't say, oh, well, God's doing it. He says, look, you're doing it. You're going to fall into it or not fall into it, because each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. There are going to be desires that come up against you in this life while various trials are happening. And, the steadfastness is being worked into you. So there's a way you could go where you stay fast on the path of the Lord. You understand that he's in control, that he's the one that's got it, that all your faith and hope and trust is put in him. But he says there's another way. There's another path that you could go down. And that path is when you are tempted and lured and enticed by your own desires. That's another option as well. He says, then desire, when it's conceived, gives birth to sin. So the idea here is that you're gonna have opportunities to trust in the Lord or to pursue your own desires. So which one are you going to do? Are you going to stay steadfast and receive the crown of life? Or are you going to say, well, actually, this desire over here, this thing I could pursue, I could put my hope in, I could do that too. But he says when you do that, when his desire is conceived, it then gives birth to sin. So there's going to be times when you have opportunity to either follow the Lord or follow your own desires. Either put all your hope and trust in the Lord or put all your hope and trust in the things that you think can fulfill you. But he says those desires eventually when they're conceived, give birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Verse 16 ties in as well. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, in whom there is no variance or shadow due to change. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be the kind of first fruits of his creation. So in these first 18 verses, James lays forth this pretty clear picture to us. The fact that you're going to face various trials. And in those various trials, you are actually being built up in the Lord. There's steadfastness being built up in you. And when that's happening, you have this opportunity to say, or to see that, okay, all of my hope and all of my joy and all of my peace is all in the Lord. Because he says you're going to want to ask for wisdom. This is what we talked about in the last video. You're going to want to ask for wisdom. But when you do, understand and believe that Jesus is the one that gives all of that. Because he says there's some people that are double-minded. They're like, well, maybe I could do, and he gives an example we saw today as we moved on, that some people are like, well, I believe in Jesus, but my plan B is also my money. And he says, well, actually, the steadfastness being built up inside of you that's being produced from all of these trials should actually push you more into Jesus so you see where your real hope lies. If it is in money, he says, that'll go away. Or if it's in the pursuit of money because you're broke as broke, like that's not going to fulfill you. He says, remain steadfast. This is where we move into verse 12. Remain steadfast, because if you do remain steadfast in these trials, not pursuing a plethora of other things, but understanding that God is the center of all things for you, or should be the center of all things for you, then you'll receive the crown of life. But he says there's going to be a temptation to follow desires to fulfill the things that you should be letting God fulfill inside of you. But you're going to have a temptation to follow these other desires. But understand, when you follow these other desires, he says, they're going to give birth to sin. And when they give birth to sin, they're going to give birth eventually to death. So you have these paths. You have this understanding that these trials could build up steadfastness in you that makes you rely more on the Lord, or they could give you this. You could follow your own desires, and eventually those desires will lead to death. But he doesn't want them to be deceived. This is why he moves on in verse 16. He says, look, every good gift, everything that is given to you comes from God. And he makes this very clear distinction that really kind of, pushes us back to verses 6, 7, and 8. So in these verses, he says this in verse 17, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, in whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. This idea here is that God doesn't, though our minds might be shifting because of the waves of life, God doesn't change. Though we are unstable in the things we do, God is not unstable in the things he does. Do you see this picture he's painting, that there are these various trials are going to happen. It's going to occur. And these are going to produce in us this steadfastness and reliance on the Lord, this Lord that we see here later in verse 17 that doesn't shift or change. But if we're double-minded in the ways that we pursue him, we don't fully trust in him. He says there's going to be these desires to pursue other things, but these desires actually lead to sin, and sin actually leads to death. So he says there's this option here that you have when you face these trials. Will they build up within you a pursuit of the Lord and a reliance on the Lord, or will you pursue your desires, which eventually lead to sin, which eventually lead to death? Because your plan A or B or C, whether it be in money or finances or other things, that's going to fall away. The Lord controls all of that anyway, he says. So are you going to stand fast in these trials and receive the crown of life, or are you going to pursue your own desires, which eventually leads to death? Are you going to be double-minded, or are you going to rely on the Lord that is steadfast and never changing? All right, guys, we'll continue next time, starting at verse 19. Thank you for watching, listening, subscribing, commenting. You guys are awesome. I'll talk to you later.